Hello, good morning. Welcome to a new week of politics at Jack and Sam's Daily, the podcast that's read all the papers, been across all the big interviews, spoken to all the experts already at this time in the morning, and we're going to give you everything you need to know about the day ahead in less than 20 minutes.
My name is Sam Coates of Sky News, and with me is Jack Blanchard of Politico, and it's Monday, November the 11th, Armistice Day. And within the space of a few hours, it feels like so much of the agenda, domestic and global, has been turned on its head in the knowledge that Donald Trump is returning to the White House from January the 20th.
Keir Starmer is off on his travels again today. He's already in Paris, France, where he'll be meeting Emmanuel Macron and Michel Barnier in the sidelines of the Armistice commemorations there. And then this afternoon, he's carrying on. He's off to Baku in Azerbaijan, an oil-rich state which is hosting the COP Climate Change Summit. And Sam, with dread in my heart, I can see behind you a hotel room. You two are off on your travels. Are you going to Baku?
I certainly am. Yep, another day, another hotel room, another double instant Nescafe. I'm in a hotel room next to, should we just say, a big London airport, where we're all about to jump on the Prime Minister's plane. It's one of those ones where we're going initially without him. He's already in Paris. He's about to have breakfast with Michel Barnier, which is his first event there at the residence. When he's done in Paris, our very, very expensive taxi service will pick him up. I don't leave the plane. He just hops on.
It doesn't get any more glamorous than that. So the Prime Minister is busy dealing with the world tilting on its axis. Let's just run through what's happening this week, Sam, as it's Monday morning before we get into the day ahead. But back here in the UK, while the Prime Minister's away, the main event is Kemi Badenoch and Jonathan Reynolds. That's the former Business Secretary, now the Leader of the Opposition, and the current Business Secretary are both appearing at the Post Office Horizon inquiry. And of course, Kemi Badenoch had that big falling out with the Post Office Chairman, Henry Staunton. She's bound to be asked about that, so that should be a bit of entertainment for people stuck back at home, not in Baku.
The Prime Minister will still be in Azerbaijan on Tuesday for much of the day. We don't know the list of people that he's meeting yet, but with so many world leaders not going, I'm sort of curious as to who they think the biggest draw in terms of meetings is, and then he'll fly home in the evening.
Wednesday PMQs as usual. Then we've got various Secretaries of State to keep an eye on appearing at the newly formed select committees. Liz Kendall, Work and Pension Secretary, she's up. Lou Haig, the Transport Secretary, she's up too. And we're getting a speech from Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary. He's speaking at the NHS Providers Conference on Wednesday.
It's a Chancellor Day. On Thursday, Rachel Reeves is doing her Mansion House speech. A bit of that was previewed in some of the Sunday newspapers as a sort of pushback to why tariffs are a bad idea, protectionism a bad idea. This is another example of the world tilting on its axis due to Donald Trump. Can't imagine that Donald Trump is listening to the Mansion House speech, but never mind. But that also coincides with a landmark review into, well, when a review's into pensions ever not landmark, Jack, but yeah, just the latest attempt, I have to say, of several to try and get British pension funds to invest more in British infrastructure. Good luck with that. We've heard it before.
And we're expecting at some point this week, Sam, to see the all-important legislation on assisted dying that's being put forward by Kim Ledbetter, the backbench Labour MP. There's a big vote coming in Parliament at the end of November on that, and we've talked about that on the podcast before. We'll be talking about it again nearer the time, I'm sure, with MPs given a free vote on whether they want to change the laws on assisted dying for the first time in this country.
As well as the other big thing this week, Get Britain Working white paper. Look, the bill for benefits and welfare is spiralling through the roof. This is the first indication, this white paper by Liz Kendall, of just how tough or not the government thinks it can be for people who are out of work or who are taking disability benefits. And there's an urgent need, there's an urgent sense in the Treasury that they need to bring down the bill as forecast over the next few years. Will this white paper actually start to set out how the government are going to do its job?
So there's plenty going on back at home, but Keir Starmer is out of the country again today and tomorrow with the trip to France and then the COP summit in Azerbaijan. We've talked about this before, Sam, about just the amount of time and focus Keir Starmer has had to spend on overseas affairs since becoming Prime Minister in July. And I feel like, the election of Donald Trump, or the imminent rise to power of Donald Trump, is really just going to put that into overdrive. He'll probably be spending even more time abroad and worrying about foreign affairs than he can possibly have dreamed of, during his campaign to be Prime Minister.
It's interesting. I can't imagine Donald Trump will see himself as a foreign policy president, but fellow world leaders, I think, are going to be focusing ever more. But this comes off the back of really quite a large amount of foreign travel by the Prime Minister, which has raised eyebrows in parts of Whitehall, or at least the bits of Whitehall that I've been talking to. It's been particular disquiet after Keir Starmer went the week before the budget to Samoa for a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting that didn't go particularly well for him. He sort of slightly lost control of the agenda that he thought he was going to be talking about. So I was just doing a little bit of research about exactly how much time he's been away since September the 1st, since sort of things got going properly after the election, after the summer break. And it's an incredible list, Jack. Ireland for 1 day, Italy for 2 days, Washington for 2 days, Berlin for 1 day, and on and on. You're going to New York for 3 days, Samoa for 5. Next week, he's going to the G7 in Brazil from Sunday through to Wednesday. In total, he has spent already, between the 1st of September and the middle of next week, 22 days on overseas trips in a 77-day period. In the same period, the Commons sat 34 days. This is a large proportion of his premiership. Yes, Trump provides some justification from here on in, but this is all pre-Trump. Are you picking up the same concerns? Do you think this could be a bit of an issue?
I mean, I think it's an issue in the sense that Keir Starmer's got an enormous domestic agenda he needs to be getting on with, and it's hard to focus on so many different things. But I do also think that if you break it all down, part of his whole thing was resetting relations with the EU. Well, he needed to go and meet some of these EU leaders and talk to them. And a lot of the summits, the summit at NATO, was he really not going to go to that? COP this week, well, that's an interesting one, because if you look at the guest list for the COP climate summit this week, pretty much no one else is going of Keir Starmer's sort of level mates. People not going to the COP summit include Joe Biden, Emmanuel Macron, Olaf Scholz, Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi, Ursula von der Leyen's not going, Justin Trudeau's not going, the Japanese. Only Giorgia Meloni and Keir Starmer of the G7 leaders will be at COP this week. So this, in that sense, I guess you might say, was missable. But I mean, even that, for a Labour Prime Minister to come in and not go to the world's biggest climate summit would have been politically pretty contentious, given the scale of the climate crisis, as everyone within the Labour Party would describe it. And also given, you'll remember this, Sam, do you remember Rishi Sunak coming into power in 2022 and planning not to go to COP? And the Labour Party went bananas at him, and they were saying it's showing no global leadership on climate and so on. And so Keir Starmer come in and decided not to go this week because he felt he was spending too much time abroad. Again, he would have come under huge political pressure over that, being accused of hypocrisy and so on. So I think it's not so much that Starmer's distracted by this. I just think there is a lot going on, and he's trying to juggle the two different things,
Look, Labour's an internationalist party. Isolation is not an option for a not particularly huge country like the UK, which is dependent on global supply chains. I think that the concern I'm hearing is a little bit more nuanced than just not turning up. The first is he's out of the country, and he's still not sorted out key bits of even his domestic team. There is no cabinet secretary. I mean, that might come this week, it might come next week. But there's, the who's in charge when he's not there, and who is just steadying the ship when his focus is elsewhere, is a matter of some discomfort for some. And secondly, you're completely right. Keir Starmer's policy is to re-engage, re-energise UK relationships overseas. But engagement itself, meetings in of themselves, are not a policy, right? All across government, the policy still seems to be we're going to be the grown-ups and we're going to make nice with all these people. But what is going to be our approach to the EU? What changes do we want with the EU? What changes do we want at COP? Just going and having the meetings is only a start. I suspect people are going to want to see the sort of colour the money of the diplomatic engagement. Although there's no doubt that diplomatic engagement is going to be needed now with Donald Trump heading to the White House more than ever before. And, how on earth do we cope with what he might do on Ukraine will be top of the list of things he'll talk with President Macron this morning in Paris.
Yeah, you would think that meeting with Macron in Paris very much arranged with the knowledge or the expectation that they might need to have a conversation about Donald Trump. Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump, of course, having this extraordinary sort of love-hate relationship themselves. Starmer's managed to avoid that so far, but you could imagine it ending up in a similar place given Donald Trump's explosiveness. The front page of the Daily Telegraph today reporting that top of the list for Macron or one of the things that Macron and Starmer want to talk about today is how much pressure they can put on Joe Biden to further tilt US policy in favour of Ukraine in his final few weeks as lame duck president. Could they convince Biden to give President Zelensky the chance to use those Storm Shadow missiles to strike Russia inside Russian territory, something that's been discussed for a long time now, but they never managed to get over the line? Could they convince Biden to somehow get more money out to Ukraine while he is still president before Trump comes in the middle of January and potentially turns the spending taps off? Those sorts of conversations may well be being had today, but as well as a broader strategy, of course, about how Europe deals with Trump coming in from a military point of view. France and Britain remain Europe's premier military powers. And so, of course, there is no more important conversation in Europe than between these two guys. And it's just going to dominate every conversation, Sam, don't you think?
I know, because I've talked to some people, that there is an awful lot of hope that when it comes to Ukraine, something can be done, sort of as the Telegraph says, in the next 9 weeks that helps advance Ukraine's position before the next president takes over the White House. But it is absurd to think that Ukraine-Russia policy is going to change in a material way with a lame duck president in the White House, even if the White House is able to splash the cash a bit more or tilt policy a little bit. The divisions on things like whether or not missiles should be allowed to be fired deep into Russian territory are unlikely to be solved in this time frame. I don't know about you, Jack. I've watched too many US presidents hope that they can do something in the dying days of their period in the White House. I'm thinking of all those who tried to solve the Middle East crisis after the point that their successor got appointed. It just tends not to happen. They don't really have a mandate anymore. So big changes feel unlikely. People are going to concentrate on what Donald Trump wants to do, not what an outgoing Joe Biden is capable of doing.
Yeah, I entirely agree. And it's fascinating to watch the conversation playing out in America. There seems to be some residual hope within Europe and within Britain that Donald Trump's ultimate Ukraine policy may not be quite as severe, if I can put it that way, as he has suggested in some of the interviews. And you're very much getting mixed messages out of the Trump camp on that. There was an interesting Washington Post report about the call that Trump had with President Putin last week, where Trump appeared to be being quite aggressive and warning Putin not to go further in Ukraine than he has already. Equally, we saw Donald Trump's own son, Donald Trump Jr., tweeting sort of mocking pictures of Zelensky yesterday, mocking him, saying only 35 days until we cut your allowance, sort of treating him like a little kid as if the whole thing's a bit of a joke, which is very much the sort of MAGA playbook with this kind of thing. Also interesting, Sam, to see Karen Pierce, the British ambassador in America, out on the Sunday shows in the US yesterday. I don't know whether she was dispatched by the British government to go out and do the Sunday shows or whether she dispatched herself. Obviously not someone who's against self-promotion as she fights to hang on to that job. But she was again giving this message that Britain hopes and Europe hopes that Donald Trump is not just going to come in and turn off the taps on Ukraine and end the war in Ukraine in the way that some people in Europe fear. Whether that is more hope than expectation, we don't know. But that is very much the message that Europe wants to get out, is that Donald Trump doesn't want to be seen as losing this war. He sometimes says things in the heat of the battle that don't quite turn out to be exactly his policy. And I think that there is a hope, or at least vague hope, that maybe it won't be as bad for Ukraine as people fear.
I misread the signals last week. It seems as if Karen Pierce isn't going to be the British ambassador in Washington for that much longer. She'll stay for the transition, however long we define that, but probably nothing like the year I'd assumed previously. We saw in some of the Sunday papers and in the Guardian on Saturday, Lord Mandelson amongst one of the candidates. I was just messaging somebody in government about this. They said, don't rule out an official. Don't assume that we're going to get a political appointment here. They were a bit surprised by what some people thought was the front runners. They think there's a bigger field than is publicly known. So should we just spend a few minutes talking about the main thing that Keir Starmer will end up doing today, landing in Azerbaijan at the COP climate change summit? I mean, there are, I suppose, the advantage of being one of the few leaders to turn up to this when so many others haven't is that you get to claim that you can lead the argument. You are a sort of tall poppy amongst a lot, smaller poppies. And I think that that will suit Keir Starmer in a world where, it was only in, February that the EU was laying out plans to cut greenhouse emissions by 90%. And now it seems as if buying American gas might be one of the ways that the EU tries to use its leverage to avoid tariffs, completely throwing the sort of climate change agenda under the bus. And this is the reality of this climate change summit and the consequence of Donald Trump coming in. Suddenly, certainties, or what felt like certainties a year ago, are thrown up in the air as people use whatever leverage they can to avoid harsh punishment by the US. And we've got a new president that calls oil liquid gold, who is going to pull out of of all the significant climate change agreements. And so Keir Starmer is effectively going to be making the counter argument in this environment where most of the Europeans, for instance, are simply not going.
Yeah, well, it's not overblowing it to say that Keir Starmer is going to be one of the big world leaders on this agenda now. You just look at the other people who might be doing it, and they're all completely cut off at the knees. Like Olaf Scholz in Germany doesn't look like he's going to last very much longer, probably going to be replaced by someone much more conservative. Emmanuel Macron has lost so much political capital after the disaster he had there. Justin Trudeau, no idea how much longer he's going to survive as Canadian PM, but it's going extremely badly for him. He's got no domestic political capital. The Japanese are in political turmoil as well. So you go through the G7 list. Keir Starmer sort of stands alone now, Sam, as this sort of great hope of centre-left politics around the world, and would be expected to show leadership on the climate agenda, because he's one of the few leaders from that sort of way of thinking who's actually got political capital at home. It might not feel like it sometimes when we're talking about it, but don't forget, obviously, he won that massive majority only a few months ago and is actually in a very strong political position compared to many of his fellow leaders. And so, yeah, he will take it upon himself to try and show some leadership on this. But of course, the problem, obviously, barely needs saying, the problem with the climate change is that you need to do these things cooperatively, and there's only so much Britain could ever do on its own.
And there is a fear that the climate change COP agenda does slightly run away from him in the way that the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting agenda slightly ran away from him. That it's quite a techie summit, and one of the main things on the table is climate finance. And before you all switch off, that's basically developed countries paying developing countries to get fossil fuels out of their system. It's ever so slightly reminiscent of the sort of reparations argument, but it is not an argument that the British government ever enjoys. And as a consequence, the extent to which countries fight effectively for more money, for more transfers, when there is no money left, as Treasury ministers keep saying, is a difficult one. And we're also just in a world where, the reality is, all the studies showed that we're not going to meet the 1.5% Paris target. Not enough was done. And the question for Keir Starmer really is, how are we going to cope if world temperatures go up to 2.5, 3 degrees above 1990 levels? What spending are we going to do? What flood defences are we going to protect? How are we going to insulate ourselves from what looks like a failure of climate change policy to this point? These are really difficult issues and not actually ones beyond the handshakes and the photographs that anyone's really going to enjoy talking about.
Sam, does this mean that tomorrow's podcast you're going to be broadcasting to us live from Baku? Am I going to see you in a grainy hotel room in Azerbaijan when we meet up tomorrow morning?
We will have a lot of detail of what day and night is like in a country that in a country bordering Iran that has a long and distinguished and unusual history. So I look forward to telling you all about that in 24 hours. 24 hours where there might not be that much sleep involved.
I really feel like I'm letting the side down. I'm always broadcasting from boring old southeast London while you globetrot with the Prime Minister. Well, I hope you have a great time in Azerbaijan, and I'm sure everyone will look forward to hearing your dispatch from Baku on Tuesday morning. I want to know what they have for breakfast in Baku, Sam, and I'm looking forward to you telling me.
Each other is probably the answer. We'll see you tomorrow.
Have a good time. Bye-bye.